In the summer of 1986, the small town of Riverton lay hidden deep within the humid landscape of Louisiana. The streets curved lazily between clusters of leaning wooden houses, their porches sagging under years of heat and neglect. Spanish moss draped from the branches of ancient oaks, swaying gently in the heavy air. The banks of the Mississippi, swollen from recent rains, pressed against the levees, filling the night with the murmur of restless water. Everything in Riverton seemed suspended in time, as though the town itself had fallen into a long, drowsy dream. Michael Hayward arrived carrying more notebooks than luggage, stepping into a world that seemed both welcoming and hostile at once. He had left behind the noise of Chicago, exchanging crowded sidewalks and neon lights for quiet streets and shutters that creaked in the wind. His ambition was simple in words, but complicated in truth. He wanted to write a book about forgotten places and the legends that shaped them. Riverton had been little more than a name on a faded map, but when he first saw its empty roads and weathered facades, he felt as though the place had been waiting for him. The rhythm of life here moved slowly, guided by the rise and fall of the river, by church bells on Sundays, and by the silence that filled the gaps in between. The townspeople moved with an unhurried certainty, their gazes heavy and cautious, as if they carried the weight of memories too fragile to share. Michael walked the streets with a notebook always in hand, sketching doorways, marking down dates on gravestones, writing fragments of impressions. Yet no matter how ordinary his observations seemed, there was always something beneath the surface, something that whispered of shadows he could not yet name. Every evening, as the sun sank into the river and the sky turned the color of rusted copper, his attention was drawn to a particular silhouette on the edge of town. The Fillmore mansion stood there, its roofline jagged against the fading light. The house appeared abandoned, its shutters sealed, its walls streaked with watermarks and age. Still, it possessed a strange authority over the landscape, as though the rest of Riverton existed only in relation to its looming presence. Michael found himself pausing before it, unable to look away. He began to fill the first pages of his journal with notes about the mansion. He wrote of its stillness, of the garden tangled with weeds, of the vague impression that the air around it carried a different weight than the rest of the town. Each observation returned to the same sensation, a quiet unease that grew stronger the longer he stared. There was nothing outwardly threatening in its silence, yet he felt watched, as if the house itself kept account of his presence. The longer he remained in Riverton, the more he sensed that his journey there was less a decision than a calling, and that the town, in its own slow and secretive way, was already deciding what to show him and what to keep hidden. The Fillmore mansion loomed at the edge of Riverton like a monument to abandonment. Its shutters clung to the windows, weathered and brittle, and ivy crawled up the brick walls as if nature itself sought to reclaim what human hands had left behind. The iron gates stood crooked, rust gnawing at their hinges, while beyond them the garden had become a wilderness of thorns and tangled vines. The townspeople passed it quickly, their eyes averted, their steps unconsciously quickening, as if proximity alone might invite misfortune. The house had once belonged to Henry Fillmore, a wealthy cotton merchant whose fortune had secured him one of the grandest estates in the region. Yet his legacy had dissolved into rumor and silence. In the late 19th century, Henry, his wife, and their 2 children vanished without a trace. Neighbors recalled a single night filled with strange cries and flashes of light over the river, but no answers ever followed. The mansion had stood empty ever since, its doors sealed but never sold, as though Riverton itself had no will to disturb it. Michael uncovered fragments of this history in the town's modest library, piecing together faded newspaper articles and fragile records. The words were stained by time, yet their details carried an uneasy weight. They spoke of neighbors hearing frantic voices, of lanterns glowing at odd hours, of a silence that fell too suddenly the following morning. The official accounts described the family as missing, but the unspoken belief persisted that they had been claimed by something older and darker than ordinary misfortune. Drawn deeper by every page he read, Michael returned to the mansion day after day. He would linger at the rusted gates, sketching the lines of the roof, tracing the cracks in the stone, and noting how shadows seemed to cling longer here than anywhere else in Riverton. His notebooks filled with observations, yet they carried more than mere description. Between his lines was an unshakable sense of being observed, as if the house itself bore witness to his curiosity. Sometimes, in the stillness of dusk, he thought he caught movement behind the boarded windows. A flicker of shape, a shifting of shadow, too deliberate to be imagination, yet too fleeting to prove real. At other times, he believed he heard faint murmurs rising from within the walls, whispers muffled as though spoken from behind water. The sound unsettled him not for its clarity, but for its persistence, returning in moments when he stood entirely alone. Michael's fascination grew into something heavier than research. He no longer regarded the house as an abandoned structure, but as a presence, a silent force pressing against his thoughts. His journals began to blur the line between record and confession, each entry revealing both the facts he uncovered and the unease they planted within him. The more he wrote, the more he felt that Riverton itself, with its quiet streets and lingering secrets, had tightened its hold. The town seemed unwilling to release anyone who dared to press too hard against the fragile skin of its memory. Michael's search for answers deepened into obsession. He spent long hours bent over faded newspapers, the brittle pages crumbling at his touch, their headlines whispering fragments of tragedies half remembered. The parish records, though incomplete, painted a shadowy picture of the Fillmore family. Beneath the neat handwriting of baptisms and burials lay subtle notes, suggestions that Henry Fillmore's wealth had not been built solely on cotton trade, but on darker exchanges along the river. His name surfaced beside mentions of clandestine shipments, of goods and men moved under cover of night, of debts that vanished as mysteriously as those who owed them. The archives revealed further threads. In one ledger, Michael discovered a reference to a ship that had sunk near Riverton's Bend in the Mississippi. The vessel, unnamed in the official registry, carried cargo that vanished with it. Cargo believed to include documents tying Henry to questionable dealings. No bodies had been recovered, no wreckage had been raised, and yet the ship's shadow lingered across decades of rumor. Michael read the accounts by lantern light, the flickering glow making the ink blur and deepen, as if the words themselves shifted when unobserved. The town seemed to murmur its secrets directly to him. Walking through Riverton's quieter edges, Michael felt as though the past spoke in fragments carried on the wind. He entered a derelict barn on the outskirts, its roof sagging, its beams rotted, and there among the debris, he found a child's toy horse carved from wood. Its surface was scratched, and on its underside a name had been gouged clumsily yet deliberately. The name of Henry's daughter. The discovery chilled him, not for its physical presence, but for the undeniable weight of intimacy it carried. Days later, in the library's dustiest corner, he stumbled upon a volume of maritime law, its margins filled with hurried notes. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and unsettlingly alive despite the passing years. Michael could not prove they were Henry's, but the thought took hold of him, feeding a growing sense that the man's voice reached across time, guiding him deeper into the labyrinth of memory and loss. The ink seemed too black, too present, as though it had been set down only days before. These discoveries began to follow him beyond waking hours. At night, his dreams turned vivid and insistent. He walked through the Fillmore mansion, its corridors stretching endlessly, its windows glowing with candlelight that flickered but never burned out. He heard footsteps echoing ahead of him, the rustle of skirts, the faint clink of glass, as if the house itself reassembled the life it had once contained. On the staircase, shadows stood motionless, neither hostile nor welcoming, their presence heavy with expectation. Michael woke from these dreams trembling, his notebooks filling with sketches of what he had seen. He told himself they were only the product of exhaustion, of immersion in the town's lore. But the line between imagination and reality grew faint. Each morning, the pull of the Fillmore house grew stronger, as though the mansion summoned him in silence, waiting for him to cross its threshold. He realized that his role was no longer that of an observer. Step by step, he was weaving himself into the narrative he had come to record, becoming less the chronicler of Riverton's secrets and more a figure caught within them. The story he sought was no longer something he pursued, it was something that had begun to claim him. Autumn storms descended upon Riverton with relentless force. The Mississippi swelled beyond its banks, flooding narrow streets and transforming the town into a labyrinth of muddy currents and drowned corners. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and rot, and the houses along the waterfront groaned under the weight of water seeping into their foundations. It was on such a night, with the sky torn open by lightning and the rain drumming ceaselessly against the rooftops, that Michael surrendered to the pull of the Fillmore mansion. The iron gate stood half open, its hinges shrieking as the wind forced it against the stone wall. Michael stepped through, his shoes sinking into the sodden ground of the overgrown garden. The house loomed above him, its roof sagging, its windows dark hollows, except for one faint glimmer deep within. The flicker was barely perceptible, more a suggestion than a flame, but it was enough to guide him forward. He crossed the porch, pushed against the swollen wooden door, and entered. Inside, the house breathed decay. Water dripped steadily through cracks in the roof, forming dark stains on the warped floorboards. The air reeked of mold and stagnant damp, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust. Every step he took caused the staircase to protest with a groan, the sound reverberating through the silence like a warning. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, once adorned with floral patterns, now consumed by spreading veins of black mildew. Yet, somewhere deeper within the house, a pale light pulsed like a heartbeat. Michael followed it up the staircase, his hand brushing against the banister that crumbled beneath his touch. The narrow hallway at the top seemed endless, lined with doors that leaned crookedly on their hinges. At the end, one stood slightly ajar, and from within spilled the faintest glow. He pushed it open and entered the children's room. The space was eerily preserved, as if untouched by the passing years. Faded drawings of ships still adorned the walls, their outlines smudged yet unmistakable. A crib sat in the corner, shrouded in dust and cobwebs, its bars warped but intact. A single wooden block lay abandoned on the floor, worn smooth by hands long gone. The silence in the room was oppressive, pressing against his ears until even the sound of his own breath seemed too loud. Then the floor shifted beneath him with a groan, and he froze. In the cracked mirror leaning against the wall, he caught sight of his own reflection, or what should have been his reflection. The face staring back at him was wrong. His features wavered, dissolving at the edges as if submerged in water. His eyes hollowed into voids, his mouth blurred into shadow, and his entire image fractured into something unrecognizable, something that did not belong to him. He stumbled backward, but the reflection did not mimic his movement. It lingered, staring, its emptiness reaching toward him. The room filled with sound. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it grew quickly into a chorus of whispers. Countless voices, layered upon one another, speaking words he could not decipher. Some were pleading, others mocking, and some wept with quiet despair. They swirled around him, filling the air with an unbearable density, as though the walls themselves had begun to breathe with the weight of memory. Michael clutched at his head, trying to shut them out, but the voices pressed closer. In the shifting shadows of the room, he thought he saw figures standing in the corners. Indistinct shapes, the outlines of people blurred into the darkness. Their presence was undeniable, their gaze fixed upon him, though their faces were lost in shadow. It was then he understood. The house was not merely abandoned, it was inhabited by echoes of those who had vanished. Their lives, their endings, their grief, and their silence had been absorbed into its walls, into its very foundation. The Fillmore mansion was no longer just a place. It was a vessel holding fragments of souls unwilling to depart. And now it reached for him, drawing him into its story, demanding he take his place among its unending chorus. Michael staggered from the room, but the whispers followed, threading through the hallways, growing louder, more insistent. He knew then that stepping inside had not been an act of investigation. It had been a surrender. The house had chosen him, and it would not let him go. The storm pressed harder against Riverton as night deepened. Wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and bending the trees until they seemed ready to snap. Rain fell in sheets, hammering against rooftops and pooling in the alleys, flooding the lower parts of town until the river and the streets became indistinguishable. Inside the Fillmore mansion, however, there was only the sound of dripping water and the scratch of a pen moving swiftly across paper. When the rains finally ceased and the waters of the river withdrew, Riverton returned to its uneasy calm. The streets dried slowly, leaving behind the smell of mud and moss. People ventured out again, murmuring about the destruction and the storm, but whispers soon turned to the mansion that loomed by the river. Curiosity drew a few of them inside, though most kept their distance. What they found was unsettling. Michael sat in the library, hunched over an ancient desk that had not been used in decades. The surface was warped, scarred with stains of ink and water, but beneath his hands it felt strangely alive. His pen moved without pause, the nib gliding across yellowed sheets as though guided by something greater than himself. He no longer paused to think, no longer reached for words. They came to him in torrents, sentences unfurling fully formed, flowing through him as if dictated by the very walls that enclosed him. The manuscript grew quickly, page after page filled with a story that was not his own. The words spoke of a captain whose pride had doomed his ship, of a crew swallowed by storm and silence, of voices lost to the currents of the Mississippi. They told of the Fillmore family, bound to secrets that had stained their legacy, and of a river that demanded a price from anyone who dared to look too closely into its depths. Michael read none of it as he wrote. His eyes blurred, his hand ached, yet he did not stop. The act of writing had become a compulsion, a ritual, a channel through which the house spoke. Shadows shifted along the walls, stretching higher with every flicker of lightning. The shelves around him, lined with books swollen from years of damp, seemed to lean inward, as though drawn by the power of the words spilling onto the paper. The air grew colder. Each breath left his lips in a pale mist, lingering in the stillness before dissolving into the gloom. Somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed shut, though no one else was there. Michael's thoughts had dissolved into fragments. He no longer considered himself an author shaping a narrative. He was only the instrument, a hand moving across paper, the vessel through which forgotten truths demanded to be remembered. The story consumed him, dragging him further from the present moment, until he could no longer distinguish between what he wrote and what he lived. The boundaries between himself and the characters blurred. He felt the spray of the river against his face, heard the cries of sailors lost in the dark, and saw the looming figure of the captain standing at the bow of a doomed vessel. The sound of water grew louder. It began as a murmur, like the echo of rain in a distant chamber, but soon it filled the room with the roar of an approaching flood. The walls of the mansion trembled as if shaken by the storm, though outside the thunder had stilled for a brief instant. Drops of water slipped through the ceiling, pattering onto the floorboards, growing into steady streams. Michael did not look up. His hand continued to race across the paper, even as the ink bled into the dampened surface, smudging the letters. Then he felt it, the weightlessness. His body no longer anchored him to the chair. His hand, though still moving, seemed detached, drifting as if suspended in water. His chest tightened, but there was no pain, only the sensation of release. The room around him faded into mist, the shadows dissolving into the sound of rushing water that now filled every corner. The desk, the pen, even his own hand blurred, as though they too belonged to another time. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the mansion was silent, save for the faint scratching that still seemed to echo from the desk, though no hand held the pen. No trace of Michael Hayward remained. His room at the hotel stood empty, his belongings untouched, his name unspoken on the registry after the storm. People searched for him briefly, combing the streets and questioning travelers, but soon the effort faded. It was as if he had never existed beyond the words he had left behind. The notebook became his only legacy, a record that seemed to belong both to the present and to the distant past. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed they had seen a man's silhouette in the window of the mansion on misty nights, his figure illuminated for a moment before fading into darkness. Others swore they had heard the rhythmic clatter of a typewriter, though no such machine had been in the house for decades. A few said that when they pressed their ears against the library door, they could hear the faint scratching of a pen moving steadily across paper. Tourists began arriving, drawn by the promise of a ghost story. Guides spoke of the Fillmore curse, of the river's endless hunger, and now of the vanished writer who had joined the shadows. For outsiders, it was entertainment, another tale to add to the South's long list of haunted legends. For those who had lived their whole lives in Riverton, it was something more. They shook their heads knowingly, repeating the same words. The city had taken him, as it had taken others before. The mansion remained empty, yet it was never silent. It became part of Riverton's identity, another place where memory blurred with myth. The legend of the writer who disappeared into his own story fused with the older tales of the Fillmore family and the river that guarded them. Children grew up hearing that Riverton never released those who tried to uncover its secrets. As the years passed, the story of Michael Hayward settled into the fabric of the town. His name appeared in hushed tones, in the cadence of warnings told by lamplight, in the quiet unease of locals who avoided the road by the river at night. The legend of Riverton was complete, a reminder that the past was never buried, only waiting, and that those who sought its truth might one day become part of it.